Hello, everyone. I'm back. I'm here with Safi Bahcall, who is the president of a biotech company outside of Boston called Synta. And we're going to be discussing the crisis of the pharmaceutical industry. Basically, what has happened in the pharmaceutical industry over the last decade or so is a kind of creative catastrophe. Is that a fair way of saying it? Billions and billions and billions of dollars have been spent in the pursuit of new drugs, and vanishingly few new drugs have come out of that process. And there's two explanations for this. One is that it's just really hard to find new drugs. And the second explanation is that they're going about it the wrong way. And Safi over here is the proponent of the latter position. He believes that Big Pharma has made the mistake of over-planning. They have engineered out serendipity. And such is his commitment to serendipity that we did not in any way plan or rehearse this conversation. That's a joke. So what we want to do is to have a discussion about drugs and how to find them that I hope will morph into a much larger and more interesting discussion about creativity and what it takes to incorporate the creative process into some larger business enterprise. So why don't you start, Safi, start and tell us what is the creative paradigm that all the big pharmaceutical companies have embraced in recent years?
Well, let me start by, actually first, you alluded to a crisis in pharmaceuticals. So let me just start by trying to quantify that and give people a sense of the magnitude of what we're talking about. In 2005, the pharmaceutical R&D spend in the United States was about 20, if you look at the six of the largest pharma companies, they spent a total of $20 billion. Mm-hmm. And the total number of new drugs that came out of those six companies that year that were approved by the FDA was 0. And that's a lot of money for no new drugs. And really, and you say this is as you said, it's an increasing crisis. About over the last decade, the amount of dollars spent on R&D has increased by a factor of 4 or 5, and the total number of new drugs are decreasing. And that really is a crisis, not just from a business perspective, which is reflected in how these companies are valued over the last few years, but a crisis for all of us who care about having new drugs for fatal diseases, for severe diseases. And to sort of get to what you're talking about, let me just start by saying how the pharmaceutical industry was born. In many ways, the pharmaceutical industry was born 100 years ago with a dentist who observed when he gave an antiseptic, that's something you use to sort of clean your hands, to a patient sitting in his chair, that the patient said, "My God, my tooth pain is gone." And I think it's probably more that he was just trying to escape, but actually something was really happening there. And he called up Bayer, and long story short, that became aspirin. And that really started the pharmaceutical industry.
So it's born with a kind of serendipity model.
It's a serendipity model. An even more classic, more recent example is the discovery of Viagra. So this was, Viagra started with a bunch of cardiologists and scientists saying, we have this idea for how, you can alleviate angina or heart pain, kind of reduce blood pressure. And so let's try it in some clinical trials. And they tried it in some clinical trials, and it was a total bust. And so the physicians running the trial, like they usually do, they called up the patients and they said, well, thank you very much for your time and participating, and we'd like the drug back now. And what they found was that the male volunteers on the trial said, no. And they said, well, probably you didn't understand. The trial is over and it's done, and we'd like our drug back. And they said, no, we understood. No, you're not getting your drug back. And so they did a little homework and found out that it had.
So what you're saying is we have one model in the pharmaceutical industry, which is the historical model,
right,
which is that as often as not, you find things by accident. In other words, you do not find the thing that you set out to find, and that when you discover a drug that has a particular effect, you may not know why it has that effect, right? So on two levels, you're essentially proceeding blindly.
Exactly.
So that's model number one.
Right.
Now, what has happened to pharma over the last 10 years?
Well, what happened was really, it started maybe 20, 30 years ago with all this incredible progress in biology and chemistry, but particularly with the rise of genetic engineering, in the last 10 years, 5 years, the sequencing of the human genome and this complete shift of the pendulum towards genetics and genetically engineering and rationally designing drugs. And that's led pharma to a belief that you can industrialize drug discovery, that you can, in effect, replace the sort of creative thought process with a factory of workers and machines that you can plan out.
So let's talk about how that works in, let's do a hypothetical example. Sure. I'm a research scientist at Pfizer. I'm a believer in this, what you call rational drug design. So I make an observation that what? That a certain protein in my body, in the human body, has the effect of lowering blood pressure.
Right. So we'll start with a very specific example of a drug at our company, at my company. Mm-hmm. And the difference that really illustrates kind of the traditional method where you have to, where you have some pretty good idea and some senses and some hunches, and you try things out and you're kind of open to what happens, and you're looking for the anomalies, the things that are real scientific insight. Scientific insight is about finding anomalies and trying to go with them. And that's kind of how drugs have always been discovered. Mm-hmm. And a new approach, which has really pervaded the industry over the last 10 or 20 years, is you have to have a real understanding of how anything works, exactly how your drug goes into the body, how it goes through your mouth, your throat, your stomach, into the blood, into the liver, exactly what cell it hits, what protein it hits, and you have to prove that hitting that protein affects the disease.
So walk me through a hypothetical example of that particular, how that reasoning might work in a pharma company.
Sure. Let's say, we have a drug at my company that a few months ago we announced was the first drug in 30 years that's making a difference for patients with melanoma, with skin cancer. It's really doubling the time that they can live with sort of stable disease. It started with 10 or 12 years ago, a bunch of scientists noticing in the lab this kind of funny little property, that when you applied our drug to these cancer cells in the lab, this particular little protein would pop up on the surface of these cells. Mm-hmm. Not much was known about that protein. You really didn't know exactly what the drug was doing in the cell and where it went and what the genes were and which gene did what thing and this thing and that thing. But they had sort of an intuition that that might be useful. And they tried it out in a couple of sort of early models. And we took a chance. And we designed some kind of pretty clever and creative experiments. And they take a very long time. But eventually we, succeeded. If you'd have gone to a large pharma organization today, and there would be a committee, and then there would be a committee that reviewed that committee, and then there'd be a third committee that reviewed the first two committees. And you'd have to present to them, and each of them would have 97 criticisms, and they'd all be valid. You can't tell me which gene. You can't tell me where.
So you would say, I've got this thing. I see that when I apply this substance to cancer cells, a certain protein pops up. I think it's interesting. And so the committee says to you, tell me precisely why it's interesting. Is that it?
Exactly.
What exactly is that protein doing?
And even more so, all we did is kind of observe. If you imagine this is a cell. A cell is a big thing with thousands and thousands of proteins. All we observed is that when we applied our drug to these cells in a dish, some kind of crazy things happened. The cells started deforming, and these little things started happening, and we thought that was a good idea. But we couldn't tell you when it went inside exactly what, picture of the chemical structure of this binding and that binding, and it hit this guy and not that guy, which is what, in many cases, you need today.
So in a big pharma company, they would ask you to describe precisely the mechanism.
Exactly.
That the nature of the interaction between your drug and these cells.
Exactly.
And you're saying you didn't know that.
I didn't know that.
Do you know that now?
We're working on it now, but we still don't know it 100%.
So in other words, your drug hasn't been approved.
Not yet.
Oh, you're now, but you're along the process.
We're in kind of the final stages.
So you have a drug in the final stages, and yet you still cannot completely explain why it works the way it works.
Exactly.
And it's that level of uncertainty, you're saying, that big pharma
and serendipity and openness to new discoveries. Now, I'll give you another example. Do you take Tylenol?
Yeah, I feel like you put on the spot here. Why, yes.
Well, does anyone... I'm glad to hear that, Malcolm. That's excellent. It's a great drug. And I get no commission. It's been about 50 years since Tylenol's been out, and no one has any idea how that works. And the vast majorities of drugs are like that.
Yeah.
And if you only say, it's sort of, look, you had a very interesting panel earlier today where there was some guy who had a program that could predict or attempted to predict whether a song would be a blockbuster by analyzing the frequencies. And taking that approach to the extreme is sort of the problem
Yeah.
with Big Pharma today. It's basically, it's as if there was a law that was passed in the United States, and they said no artist could ever record a song until they could prove mathematically it would generate over $1 billion in sales.
Or fall in within one of those 60 clusters
Exactly.
that Mike was talking about. Now, so the way you are talking right now makes it sound really obvious that there's something crazy here. So why are all of these companies full of, geniuses? Why are they so resistant to the notion that there should be some uncertainty built into the product? What's going on at Pfizer and Merck that makes them want to have a full explanation before they spend any money?
Well, I think it's actually a problem that it's not a specific Pfizer or Merck. It's really a organizational and structural problem. Let me ask you a question. How many writers are there at the New Yorker?
Oh, I have no idea. 40?
40. So imagine that the New Yorker had 100,000 writers.
Mm-hmm.
And you were one of them. Malcolm Gladwell was writer, 52,342.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a committee that decided, what project you should work on, and several more committees to approve that project, and any change to the project had to be run by 3 more committees. And you were assigned one paragraph of a, 792-page paper.
Mm-hmm.
How motivated would you be to take some wild and crazy risks? So that is sort of what happens inside a very large research organization. You're part of thousands and thousands and thousands of scientists competing on hundreds and hundreds of projects for which you work on, one very, very small element. That structure by itself is just not good for taking kind of the crazy wild risks you need to discover new things.
But there's something else here that, when you're talking here about a social process, that scientists who look for things need to get money from non-scientists who pay for things, right? Now, in the interaction at your company, with your drug that you were talking, your melanoma drug, you say you would like us to give you, how much money did you spend on that melanoma drug, by the way?
To date, it's probably about 50 or 70 million.
Okay. Some guy comes to you and says, I want 70 million. And you say, all right, what are you going to do with that 70 million? They say, well, we saw something really kind of cool and weird with some melanoma cells in the lab, right? And you presumably have a level of trust with these people where you say, all right, here's your money. What pharma seems to be, the big pharma is asking for is a story, right? They're not satisfied with that kind of vague an explanation. What they really want is for you to tell a story. I would like you to give me money so that I can develop this thing which does the following precise thing in the following way and will have the following result on the body. That's much more satisfying, isn't it, psychologically, for those who are deciding whether to spend $1 billion or $500 million on a drug? I mean, is it that the new technologies we have, the new genetic, biological technologies of the last 25 years, is it that they have allowed us to tell extraordinarily compelling stories that have chased the kind of vague serendipity stuff out of the...
Yeah, I think what you're getting to is they've created a new language. Mm-hmm. They've created a new language of risk management, which wasn't there before. So now if you're a senior level manager at Pfizer, if I come to you and I say, I have this drug and it's got this kind of cool things and I think it'd be a good idea. But by the way, you don't commit $500 million right up front. You do little stage things. And he says, well, whereas before, 50 years ago, he would just say, all right, try some little thing and then prove that works and try some other thing. He can now has this whole language to say, well, have you shown me the molecular target? Have you done this kind of cell type? Have you done that kind of cell type? Is there this paper? Is there that paper? Is this? And he can basically bludgeon you to death with questions that it's true that you can't answer.
And that he couldn't have asked
20 years ago.
Yeah.
So what it's done is the right answer isn't that the guy should say, yeah, whatever, you have a good feeling, go for it, knock yourself out. That's not the right answer. The right answer is that the needle should be tuned to sort of a balanced level of risk management. The real truth of drug discovery is that if you want to create something, if you want to be innovative, you have to take risks. And if you lower the level of risk, if you try to completely eliminate any risk, then you're not going to have anything creative or funky come out.
Now, why is it that requiring a story before you start, some description of the mechanism of the drug that you are pursuing. Why is it that that doesn't work as often as we'd like? Why isn't that doesn't that seem on paper to be the really rational way of making a drug?
The problem is because science is in the body and complex interacting systems, they're so complex. There's so many moving parts. They're interacting in so many different ways that it's very, very hard to predict exactly what will happen. It's almost as if, if I could understand your, Malcolm Gladwell's neural wiring, I could predict when I show him a painting whether you'd be happy or sad. Mm-hmm. It's about that complex. There's so many interacting pieces that it's just very, very hard to predict. So the point is not to tell a story, but the point is dialing the level of risk, that you have something that's good enough, that it's worth taking a little bit of risk.
The story creates a misleading level of certainty about the process, is what you're saying.
Right, that you can both reduce the risk, and the problem is that sometimes it's very easy to fall into a trap of an oversimplified story. I'll give you an example. There was a famous interview done at Harvard about 20 years ago where they went around with a video camera and asked all sorts of Harvard alumni, professors, faculty, students, why is it warmer in the summer? And the answer was, the vast majority of people said, well, it's warmer in the summer because that's when the Earth is closest to the sun. And the problem is that explanation is completely wrong. It's a very simple and logical sounding explanation, but the fact is that it's summer here when it's winter in Australia and vice versa. So it just can't be right, because that just doesn't physically make sense. And in fact, the right answer has to do with the tilt of the Earth as it moves along. And so there are very simple sounding explanations that give you a lot of psychological comfort, too much comfort. The reality of science and complex systems is that they're very difficult.
There's an extraordinary, an interesting irony in all of this, which is nobody would concede that would dispute that over the last 25 years, we haven't made mind-boggling progress in our understanding of human biology, right? But what you're saying is that progress that we've made in being able to understand and explain what goes on in the body is at the moment having the effect of impeding our own creativity. In other words, this is an example of a little knowledge being a dangerous thing, isn't it?
It's exactly right. I think it's, and in fact, that isn't the first. There are several people who suggested that all the understanding in genomics and genome would lead to a decrease in productivity in R&D, and that's exactly what's happened. Rather than take big, understand how pharmaceuticals were created, lidocaine. That was discovered. It's one of the most commonly used anesthetics, and there was a Swedish scientist in a lab who happened to taste a plant extract, put it on his tongue, and his tongue was numb. That became one of the biggest selling anesthetics of all time, and they have no idea how it works, or still have barely idea. But that led to a decrease in productivity.
Is this because we just don't know enough? So eventually, do we hit a point where we know enough about human biology that we can predict nicely and beautifully what we need to be doing? Are we just in the are we in the woods and about to come out of the woods? Or do you think this is will-o'-the-wisp?
Well, I think there's two things. I think it's absolutely right. We've learned an enormous amount, and a lot of research dollars have been invested in this. Sometimes it's a little bit of a red herring. Pfizer spends $8 billion a year on research, and not that many great new drugs come out. So it may not be they may not be allocating their $8 billion of R&D in the best possible way. But I think there's a return on investment time. People, when a new technology comes up, they get incredibly excited. They think it'll work tomorrow.
Yeah.
Monoclonal antibodies were discovered in the early 80s, and people the next day said, wow, it's a magic bullet. You put this drug in, it hits this one protein, and you're cured of cancer. Stock prices went through the roof, and it's kind of the same thing with genetic engineering. And it takes years and years. It'll get there. Monoclonal antibodies now are making a great difference in cancer, selling billions of dollars, but it takes a decade or 2 decades. So we will get there. But an important thing is that we have to change the structure of the industry, and I think the structure of the industry is changing because as pharma companies and research organizations get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, almost no matter what they do not become a good place for, what you really need. Instead of a factory of workers with machines using genetics, it's more like, and this is sort of extreme, it's more like a colony of artists with paintbrushes. And you need an organizational structure that encourages that kind of creativity and risk-taking. Otherwise, you'll just ossify.
You know, this is interesting. I want us to broaden the discussion in our last few minutes beyond drug discovery to this more general question of what creativity is. Because when you describe those examples you give of serendipitous drug discovery, you know, the lidocaine, the Viagra, in all those cases, this not to be sort of excessively self-referential here, but following on the heels of my denunciation of geniuses this morning, in all of these cases, the inventor of the drug is not in control of the process, right? They don't know what they need to know. They simply happen to be, they're prepared, but they simply happen to be in a position where they can observe some chance occurrence and draw an appropriate lesson from it. They don't have to be on top of everything, in other words, to be agents of discovery. Now, I'm wondering whether that's a kind of a general, is that what creativity is? In other words, is creativity always a kind of step removed from knowledge in that sense? Does that make sense, that question? And if it didn't, it may be because I'm just super creative and haven't fully grasped the concept that I'm talking about.
If I didn't, could I say it on this panel? That was the dumbest thing no. No, I think, you know, creativity, when you really see it in science, it often ends up being the guy who finds that teeny little anomaly that everyone else overlooked. And he says, you know what, that little thing is really important. And people eventually, 20 years later, 50 years later, say, what a creative genius. But in fact, there's an enormous amount of persistence. Like Alexander Fleming, there's another classic tale of serendipitous drug discovery with penicillin and the mold in the dish. And in fact, there's a much longer story to that. I mean, there had been a long literature about molds and can they have this effect, and he had been studying that literature and he was very familiar with it, and no one believed him and there was incredible persistence on his part required to convince people that there was something, and him and another guy named Florey, to convince people. So I think creativity is about finding those little anomalies and having the persistence and having a passionate champion. And in order to make that work in a business setting, you have to have an organizational structure that allows that. I mean, if Malcolm Gladwell was, you know, one writer of 100,000 working on one sentence in a 500-page story, would you be able to come up with these kind of wacky story ideas?
I'm reminded, speaking of wacky, there's a very famous paper written in the 60s about the floppy rabbit ear phenomenon. Do you know about this? I realized I kind of leaned back as if I was about to tell a yarn that had absolutely no truth to it. But it was independently observed by two research teams in the late 60s that if you fed rabbits this particular protein, their ears, the cartilage in their ears collapsed temporarily, but it just collapsed. So their ears, which are like, you know, have a certain structure that just go poof. And the one guy who discovers this is very, very busy on another project, observes it and says, that's weird, and keeps going. The other person's career is sort of at a dead end. All of his projects aren't working. He's not terribly good at what he's doing, notices this, and because he has nothing else going on, pursues it and makes this extraordinary finding about the nature of this little protein that can cause cartilage to collapse. But there's a case where the creative guy, the person who makes the real contribution to our world, makes the contribution by virtue of the fact that he's not succeeding at his job, right? Whereas the person who is succeeding is the one who fails to make the contribution. Now, I love that in a certain way, and I think that it's tremendously relevant to what we're...
You're positioning yourself as a champion of failure.
No, not a failure, but I mean, in all of these cases that you've talked about serendipity, Viagra was a failed drug.
That's right.
Right? The people who tried to promote that drug as for some heart ailment were wrong. Right?
That's right.
Yet it was out of that error that we got something that, well, I hate to say that it's of ultimately greater importance, although it just might be. Well, we are on floppy ears. I think we have to stop. But thank you very much.
Thank you.